The first thing Eli Rourke noticed about the woman at his gate was that she sat a blown mare as if she knew the difference between fear and bad manners. The second was the bundle tied to her saddle horn with faded blue twine he had once cut from a flour sack at his own kitchen table. He knew that knot. He had tied it with cold fingers on a Sunday in January and told himself, as he had told himself every Sunday for 4 years, that sending the letter was not the same thing as begging. She reined in without fuss. Dust sat pale on the hem of her dark skirt. The mare's chest was white with salt. The woman looked at Eli the way a person studies a house after dark, trying to decide whether the lamp in the window means welcome or danger. "You wrote these to Rose Vale," she said. His hand tightened on the rawhide rein he had been mending. The smell of singed leather from the small brazier beside him mixed with horse sweat and August sage. He did not ask how she had come by the letters. The answer already stood before him, straight-backed and travel-worn, with 30 or 40 pieces of his private foolishness bouncing lightly against a saddle horn. "Did I?" "You did. Then you rode a long way to return what wasn't yours." "I rode a long way because one of them came open in the rain, and after that I knew they shouldn't have been where I found them." The yard went still around them. A windmill turned with a dry squeal beyond the barn. Somewhere behind the chicken coop, Toby Finch stopped whistling mid-note. The boy had a habit of whistling through his front teeth whenever he was nervous, and right then the silence he left behind felt louder than a gunshot. Eli set the rein across his knee and stood. He was not a tall man, but there was a hardness to the way he carried himself that made men step wide around him in town. Not because he was mean. Mean men leaned forward. Eli always looked as if he were leaning against whether no one else could see. "Who are you?" he asked. "Mara Quinn." "Are you Rose Vale?" "No." The answer ought to have shamed him. Instead, it landed with a queer kind of relief. A man who had lived alone long enough could get tired even of his own secrets. Toby edged around the corner of the house, a pail in one hand and wide eyes in his freckled face. He was 16, all knees and elbows, with straw-colored hair that never did what it was told. "Mr. Rourke," he said softly, "you want me to take her horse?" Mara slid from the saddle before Eli could answer. She landed a little stiffly, favoring her left side for one step and then hiding it. She untied the bundle and held it out with both hands. "If you want to burn them, she said. "If you want to throw them in the creek, do that. But read the postmarks first." That made him look. He took the letters because not taking them would have been a spectacle, and Eli Rourke had spent most of his life keeping his pain from becoming one. The envelopes were worn soft at the edges. Some bore the medicine bow stamp. Some had the black return mark of the dead letter office. On every one, in his own careful hand, was the same invented name. Mrs. Rose Vale. General Delivery. Medicine Bow, Wyoming. A name made from nothing. Rose because Anna had once kept a chipped teacup with red roses painted around the rim. Vale because every sound carried differently in low country, and he had liked the thought of his words dropping somewhere sheltered. He had never imagined they might one day ride home. Mara Quinn took off her gloves one finger at a time. Her hands were not fine. The knuckles were nicked, the fingertips calloused from work that did not happen in parlors. Her wedding band was gone, but the pale groove of it remained. "I found them in a mailbag among my husband's effects," she said. "He died in Cheyenne in March. The bag should never have been there. Neither should those letters." Eli looked up. "Your husband was a postman?" "Railway mail clerk." "Then the government ought to be the one returning my property." A flicker crossed her face. Not anger. Worse than anger. A practiced sort of shame. "Perhaps," she said. But the government didn't read enough to know a man had been telling the truth into an empty place for years. He should have thrown her off the land that instant. He knew it. A decent man would not let a stranger keep talking after such an admission. But then Toby took the mare's reins, and the horse lowered her head into the boy's shoulder as if she had run beyond manners and come out the other side into need. Eli had gentled enough frightened stock to know what he was seeing. The woman had ridden hard on a tired animal because stopping somewhere else had felt worse. If you're listening with evening coming on where you are, and the kettle's on, or your hands are busy with mending or supper dishes, tell me what patch of earth you're keeping company from tonight, because some stories travel farther and settle deeper when they know where they've been welcomed. The screen door banged open behind him. June Pritchard, the postmistress from town, came down the path without waiting to be invited, a bonnet askew on her gray hair, and a ledger tucked under one arm. June never walked anywhere if she could instead arrive as though the truth had sent for her. "I saw the rider from the ridge," she said, not breathing hard in the least. "Thought it might be you, Mrs. Quinn." Mara turned. "You know me? I know your letter. Came to the office last week asking after mail irregularities from Old Route Sachs. I'm June Pritchard." She peered at Eli. "And before you decide to be proud at her, you might hear the rest." Eli's jaw worked once. "I'm hearing too much already." June planted the ledger on the wash bench. "You mailed near every one of those from my counter, Eli. No return address, same false name every time, and I minded my business because grief doesn't always wear church clothes. If these were found in a route clerk's private effects, then somebody in Cheyenne or on the line kept mail that ought to have gone on to dead letter. Mrs. Quinn came to me first, and I told her if she meant to set one thing right before God took count, she'd better bring them straight." Mara looked at June with quick gratitude and just as quick caution, as if gratitude had been used against her before. Eli stared at the bundle. The yard smelled of hot boards and dust, and the onions Toby had laid near the cellar door to dry. There was no place left to set his eyes that didn't feel like it belonged to somebody else. The sound of wagon wheels came up the lane. A buckboard rolled through the gate carrying Harlan Voss and a deputy Eli did not know well enough to dislike properly. Harlan climbed down with the same neat, unhurried care he brought to every act in public, from lighting a cigar to taking a man's land. His boots were polished. His vest was the dark blue of money kept indoors. "Eli," he said, "I was told I might find you here. You found me." Harlan's gaze moved to Mara, then to the letters in Eli's hands, then back again. It barely paused, but Harlan missed very little. "I see you've company," he said pleasantly. "Business?" Eli asked. "Always." Harlan drew a folded paper from his inside pocket. "Your note on the spring pasture comes due in 8 days. Given your arrears at the mercantile and the short count at the last shipping, I thought it neighborly to ride out myself. Sign the transfer on the South 40 and water rights, and I can keep the rest of the place off the auction block." Toby made a small sound that might have been a curse if he had learned it from anyone but cattlemen. Eli did not take the paper. There was no short count. Harlan smiled, as if indulging a child who insisted the moon was a coin nailed to the sky. "The rail tally says otherwise. I have the figures." June's nostrils flared. "You always do." Harlan ignored her. "I could use a steady foreman once the papers are done. You know stock. There's no sense making this uglier than it must be." Mara spoke before Eli could. "May I see the note?" Harlan turned his head slowly toward her. "And you are?" "Mara Quinn." His eyes sharpened just enough to show he had filed the name somewhere useful. He handed her the paper with courtly fingertips, as though generosity cost him nothing and everyone ought to notice. Mara read in silence. Eli watched her eyes move. He had never trusted people who could read fast. It seemed too much like having extra doors in your head. "This amount is wrong," she said. Harlan folded his hands. "Madam, I assure you it is not. The interest is compounded against a delivery account that was already credited in April. It was not credited in full." She lifted her chin a little. "According to what record?" "According to mine." Eli felt heat rise in his chest. Not the hot, quick temper of younger men. This was older and meaner, like banked coals stirred awake. "I shipped 63 head in April," he said. "You paid me for 52. Then perhaps you counted poorly." The deputy shifted his weight. Toby looked ready to fling the onion basket at somebody's face. June Pritchard's mouth became a line fit to cut cloth. Mara held the paper a moment longer. Then she glanced at the letters and back to Eli. It was a short glance. It changed everything. "Did you mention the shipping in those?" she asked quietly. He stared at her. "What?" "The dates. Head count. Weather delay. Which steers went lame. The sort of things a man says when he's writing to be known." Harlan gave a small laugh. "My dear lady, if this is some romantic method of bookkeeping, I admire the invention if not the discipline." Eli ought to have denied it. Instead, he heard himself say, "Sometimes. Then your records may be better than his." The yard fell silent again. Even the windmills seemed to listen. Harlan's expression barely altered, but Eli saw the first true calculation enter it. Mara had seen it too. She handed the note back without looking at Harlan again. "If I were you, Mr. Rourke," she said, still watching Eli, "I would not sign anything today." Harlan took the paper and smiled his indoor smile. Then I hope for your sake he has wiser counsel by Thursday. He tipped his hat to Mara with enough courtesy to feel insulting, climbed into the buckboard, and rolled away in a haze of pale dust. The deputy followed. Toby spat after them once they were through the gate. June exhaled through her nose. That man's civility has always smelled like a trap sprung fresh. Mara did not smile. She looked at the bundle in Eli's hands as if it weighed more than paper. "May I see one?" she asked. He ought to have said no. Instead, he pulled the top letter free and gave it to her. She read only the first page before lowering it. Eli knew every line on it. He had written it after the April drive, with his shoulders aching and his boots white with alkali, telling a woman made of ink that one brindle steer with a torn left ear had tried to break the chute, that Toby had nearly been kicked, that Harlan's scale beam had settled too fast for honest work, and that he was tired in a place no sleep reached. Mara touched the date beside the postmark. "These aren't just letters," she said. No one answered. She looked up at last. They're a ledger written by a lonely man who had no idea he was keeping one. That was the point of no return. Not the woman at the gate. Not Harlan's paper. Not even the shame of seeing his own invented name in a stranger's hands. It was the moment Eli Rourke understood that the private foolishness that had kept him alive through 4 winters might now be the only thing standing between his land and a man who smiled while measuring out ruin. He took the letter back as if it might bite him and said, "Come inside." The house had 2 rooms fit for living and one that had become, over the years, a place where tools, boots, seed catalogs, broken harness buckles, and grief all gathered without asking one another's leave. Mara set the letters on the kitchen table. June brought her ledger from the post office. Toby lit the lamp, though there was still enough day to see. None of them remarked on it. Some kinds of work called for lamplight, even in daylight. Eli moved restlessly from stove to cupboard to washstand and back again, making coffee because it was a thing he knew how to do with angry hands. Through the open window came the smells of warm dust and sunstruck timothy from the north field. Mara spread 3 letters beside June's book. "You wrote every Sunday?" "Near enough." "You kept no copy?" "I was writing to get it out of me, not preserve it." June gave a small snort. "Providence preserved it anyhow, seems." Mara's finger followed the dates. "Here, April 9th. You say 63 head loaded afternoon. 2 held back lame. Storm eastward, but no rain yet. Then April 16th, you mentioned payment for 52 and Harlan saying the rest were too light to count fair. On May 7th, you write that Mrs. Baines sold her silver brooch to settle flour and coffee because the store cut off credit after her boy fell sick." Eli looked up sharply. "You read that many?" Her face tightened. Enough to understand what they were. He wanted to be angry. He did not know where to put the feeling. Anger needed edges. Shame just spread. "Those letters weren't written for your eyes," he said. "No," she answered. "They were written because no one else's were there." June bent over the ledger, pretending not to hear. Toby sat near the stove with his elbows on his knees, listening so hard he might as well have been tugging on every word. Mara folded her hands. "I can leave at dawn if that makes it easier. But if your spring goes to Harlan Voss because you were too proud to use the truth when it finally came back around, you'll hate yourself for a very long time. And I have seen enough hatred in a house to know what it costs." That made Eli look at her properly for the first time. She was not young. Thank God for it. There was no shine of easy hope on her. Her face had been made finer by weather and worry instead of diminished by them. A white scar, thin as thread, crossed the heel of her right hand. Her mouth looked as if it had forgotten how to ask for much and survived the lesson. Toby cleared his throat. "Mr. Rourke, if she can cipher better in you and Mr. Voss is crooked, seems foolish not to let her." Eli gave the boy a flat look. "I've managed this place before you had boots." "Yes, sir," Toby said. "That's how we got here." June hid a cough that looked suspiciously like approval. Night came on while they worked. Mara read. June cross-checked postmarks. Toby brought in the tobacco tin where Eli kept shipping chits and loose nails in the same unhappy company. Eli paced until June finally said, without looking up, "Sit down, Eli. You're making the floor complain." So he sat. Around midnight, Toby fell asleep with his cheek against the table. June went home muttering about respectable women and old fools. The kitchen grew close with coffee steam and lamp smoke. Outside, coyotes called thin and far away. Mara held one of the later letters near the lamp. You wrote her everything. He stared at the tabletop. Not everything. What didn't you write? He rubbed his thumb against the worn grain of the chair arm. My wife's name. Mara waited. Anna, he said at last. Saying it aloud felt like opening a box he had nailed shut badly and too late. She died having our girl. Girl died before morning. I was on a drive north of Casper because I thought one more good season would settle us proper. Came home to a house gone quiet in the wrong places. Folks sat with me a while. Then they stopped. Folks do. They got their own work. Sundays were worst. So I made up somebody who might listen long enough for me to hear myself. Mara did not offer him pity. That was one reason he did not bolt from the room. After a while she said, very softly, there's a kind of hunger biscuits won't touch. The line settled between them like something already known. He laughed once through his nose, not because it was funny but because the truth of it hurt less in her voice. She turned back to the letters, and the lamp lit the side of her face while the rest of the room gave itself to shadow. By dawn they had enough to see the shape of Harlan's theft, and not enough to beat it yet. The letters proved dates, counts, weather delays, names of drovers, and one man's consistent memory. June's postal ledger proved the dates were true to mailing. But Harlan held the scale books, the note, and most of the town's credit. Mara stood at the sink washing the coffee cups in cold gray light. He'll come harder now, she said. Let him. He'll try to buy me first. Eli looked up. Would it work? She dried a cup with the hem of a towel and met his eyes. No. That morning she rode with him into town. Word traveled ahead of them because it always did. By the time they tied horses at June's post office, Mrs. Crandall from the boarding house had already paused twice in sweeping her porch to stare, and old Ben Morley at the feed mill had found fresh reasons to lean on his broom. Eli could feel their looks the way a horse feels flies before they land. June marched them straight into the post office and hauled down an old sack of registry slips from a shelf that smelled of paste and dust. Mara's hair had slipped loose under her hat from the ride. She pushed it back with an impatient wrist and set to work like a woman laying out surgical tools. By noon they had enough to make Harlan uncomfortable and not enough to make him afraid. He appeared at the mercantile door as if summoned by the smell of resistance. Mrs. Quinn, he said, tipping his hat. You have talent with figures. I could use a bookkeeper in my office. Better room than a line shack kitchen, I imagine. Mara did not look up from the accounts she was copying. Then I expect you'll find yourself one. His smile did not shift. Loyalty is an admirable quality in a woman. Convenient, too, she said. A man stocking sacks of feed behind him let out a breath that became a cough when Harlan glanced his way. Harlan rested one hand on the counter. Eli, there is still an easy road here. Sign over the South Spring, keep your herd, and I will call the April dispute settled. Mrs. Baines keeps her store credit. The boy Finch keeps his wages. No one need make theater of private papers. There it was. Not just Eli's land. The widow's flower. Toby's place. The quiet small debts that made communities kneel without ever admitting the shape of the altar. Eli felt the old temptation tug at him the way a bad rope cuts into a palm. Give a little. Save the rest. Let the strong man keep what strong men always kept. It was the easier road because easier roads were usually built by men like Harlan. Mara went still. Toby, standing by the pickle barrel with his hat twisted in both hands, stared at Eli as though boyhood itself had come to some narrow bridge. What would you have me do? Eli asked Harlan. Be practical. It was a word Eli had learned to distrust. Practical men had told Anna he'd be wise to stay on the drive. Practical men had said grief was God's business and cattle were a man's. Practical men always seemed to finish fed. He looked at the letters in Mara's satchel. A whole life laid flat on paper. Every lonely Sunday. Every count of calves and sacks of oats and weather signs. The notes about Mrs. Baines's boy. Toby's first decent rope throw. The one old bay horse that still walked to the graveyard rise every May and stood there a while as if memory had a scent. If he used them, the town would know. They would know he had spent 4 years writing to a woman made of longing and good ink. They would know what kind of emptiness a man could carry while still fixing fences and paying wages and showing up to church twice a month in a brushed coat. If he did not use them, Harlan Voss would take the spring, and every dry month afterward would remind Eli exactly what pride had purchased. He put both hands on the counter and heard his own voice come out low and even. You draw up whatever hearing you want, he said. Bring your books. I'll bring mine. Harlan's eyes narrowed by a hair. Those scraps are not books. They are now. If you've ever had to choose between keeping your dignity hidden and laying it bare to save what matters, you know how heavy that hand feels on the latch. Tell me, what would you have laid on that table? Your pride, or your only proof? Harlan straightened. Thursday morning, then. At the church hall. Since you seem hungry for witnesses. He left without another word. The rest of that day tightened like wire. Mrs. Baines would not meet Eli's eye when he called on her. The rail clerk at Medicine Bow remembered the April shipment, but had no copies left in his office. Sheriff Noland agreed to attend the hearing, but kept polishing his spectacles with the air of a man trying not to choose a side until the side had already won. Near dusk, as Eli and Mara rode back toward the ranch, she said, he wasn't bluffing about the widow. Men like that build their power out of other people's fear. If you win, it won't just be your spring. If I win. She glanced over. You think I don't know the difference between hope and arithmetic? He almost smiled. At the yard, Toby came running from the barn, breathless. 2 riders by the south fence an hour back. I yelled and they turned off. Eli was out of the saddle before the boy had finished. He ran his hand along the nearest gate chain. Still fast. Then he looked beyond the corrals toward the south pasture where the grass dipped shallow before the creek cut through cottonwoods. Lantern, he said. Now. They found the fence cut in 3 places where darkness thickened along the draw. Not a clean slice from one angry trespasser. Methodical work. Enough to start drift once the cattle scented water. Eli swore softly. Toby took the east break. Mara, against instruction and common sense alike, swung her mare through the second opening and held the nervous yearlings off the creek bank, while Eli and Toby restrung wire by lantern light. Her seat was not pretty, but it was brave, and brave counted for more after dusk. By the time they had the last stretch tied back, sweat had dried and dried again on Eli's shirt. His hands smelled of iron and horsehide. He could feel the old ache in his left knee where a bronc had folded him under 20 years earlier. Back at the house, the kitchen lamp still burned in the window. Then Toby shouted. Smoke pushed from the crack above the tackroom door in a low black breath. Eli hit the porch at a run. The fire had taken hold where lamp oil kept best, fast and greedy. He yanked the door open and heat struck him square in the face. Saddles hung in shadow like men on a gallows. Flames licked up one wall, found the shelf of harness grease, and brightened. The letters, Mara said behind him. They were in the flour bin beside the table, where he had shoved them before riding out. Eli wrapped his hand in a horse blanket and went through. Action stripped the world to pieces. Heat. Smoke. The rough edge of the table under his thigh. The flour bin lid. Paper. Fire on the wall. A cough that tore his chest. He found the bundle. Turned. Saw, with a stillness that arrived sharper than panic, that the rafter over the door had started to go. Then Toby was there, full boy, one arm over his face. Out. Eli roared. He shoved the bundle at the boy. Reached for him. The rafter dropped behind them in a burst of sparks. Mara had the pump already going by the time they hit the yard. Water flashed silver in the firelight. Toby stumbled. Eli took the bucket from her and threw until his shoulder burned, and neighbors began arriving out of the dark with blankets and curses. When it was over, the tack room stood half open to the stars, charred and stinking. One saddle was ruined. 2 bridles smoked on the dirt. Eli's right hand had blistered red across the palm and thumb where the blanket had slipped. The letters lay blackened at the edges, but whole at the center, as though even fire had found some places harder to reach than others. June arrived wrapped in a shawl over her nightdress, hair in a long gray braid down her back. She took one look and said, That's no stove mishap. No, Eli said. Mara knelt by the bundle and very carefully lifted the top envelope. The postmark still showed. She let out a breath that shook once and steadied. Sheriff Noland came last, buttoning his coat wrong in the dark. He walked the yard, bent to the oil can by the doorway, and said, I'll ask questions in town. Ask Harlan's men first, Toby snapped. Noland gave the boy a warning look and then glanced at Eli's hand. Doc Phelps can dress that. Eli barely heard him. Mara had gone very still again, the way she did when something inside her was deciding whether silence remained bearable. This is the part one should have said sooner, she said at last. No one answered. The yard crackled in the wrecked wood. My husband didn't just mishandle the bag, she said. He kept letters. Sold stamps out of government packets. Opened what was not his if he thought there might be money tucked inside. I found your bundle under the false bottom of his trunk with a dozen others. I burned the rest that were ruined past names. I brought yours because they felt, she swallowed. They felt alive enough to belong somewhere. June closed her eyes briefly. Sheriff Noland looked from Mara to the letters and back again. If Harlan learns that, Mara said, he will call every page stolen and every date suspect. Eli stared at her, soot drying on his face, hand throbbing. The easiest thing in the world would have been to tell her to leave before dawn. Let the shame go back where it came from. Let the whole ugly business belong to another dead man and another house. Instead, he looked at the bundle in Toby's arms and understood something simple and mean about pain. Once it had cost you enough, you got careful where you spent it. They still carry June's postmarks, he said. Mara blinked as though she had expected sentence and been handed water. Yes, she said. Then tomorrow we tell what matters. The hearing filled the church hall by 9 the next morning. People who had not darkened that threshold since Christmas found sudden religion in other men's trouble. Sun came through the east windows in long bars, lighting dust above the pews and turning the black stove at the back into a dull iron silhouette. Harlan Voss sat at a table near the front with his account books laid neat as Sunday cuffs. Sheriff Noland stood by the wall. June had her postal ledger. Toby hovered near the door, hair damp where he had attempted to tame it with water and failed. Mara sat beside Eli with the bundle of letters before her, the edges singed, the blue twine replaced by a strip torn from an old clean shirt. Doc Phelps had bandaged Eli's palms so thick he felt clumsy and half-finished. Harlan rose first. He spoke reasonably. Men like him always did. He spoke of obligations, of unfortunate misunderstandings in shipping tallies, of generosity offered and refused. He did not mention the fire. That was skill too, knowing which crimes improved under silence. Then Mara stood and laid out the dates. April 9th, April 16th, May 7th. She read lines from the letters only where they named counts, weather, and shipments. She did not read the parts where Eli had written of the empty chair by the stove, or how some nights he caught himself setting out 2 plates before memory returned like a slap. For that mercy alone, he would have followed her into deeper trouble than this. June matched the postmarks. Toby testified to the April drive. Ben Morley admitted under pressure that Harlan's scale beam had been quick in the settle for months. Murmurs ran along the pews. And then Harlan did what clever men do when numbers start turning against them. He smiled. Mrs. Quinn, he said, would you tell the room how these letters came into your possession? Mara held his gaze. From my late husband's effects. Railway mail clerk Owen Quinn. Yes. He handled dead letter transfers between Medicine Bow and Cheyenne at intervals, did he not? He did. And was he known for strict honesty? The room shifted. Not loudly. A tide going under boards. Mara's fingers tightened once on the tabletop. No, she said. Harlan spread one hand, smooth and regretful. There, you see the trouble. We have before us a bundle of private correspondence, illegally retained by a dead thief, delivered by his widow, who now seeks to instruct my office in arithmetic. I do not question the lady's intentions. I question the chain of custody. The phrase sounded absurd in the little church hall, and still it landed. People straightened. Fear loved respectable language. Eli could feel the room deciding whether truth required too much courage before dinner. Sheriff Noland cleared his throat. It's a fair concern. Harlan turned his smile on Eli then, and there was the knife at last. Unless Mr. Rourke means to swear under oath that every page is his own hand and every mortifying particular upon it true. The room grew quiet enough to hear the stove settle its iron. That was the highest point of danger. Not the fire. Not the cut fences. This. A whole room waiting to learn whether a man would deny the truest, loneliest thing he had ever done in order to save his land. Sheriff Noland stepped forward with the Bible. Mara did not look at Eli. That was kindness too. She kept her hands folded so tightly he could see the bones at the base of her thumbs. Eli stood. They broke for noon before he spoke, because old Reverend Pike, who feared both scandal and fainting women in equal measure, declared no judgment ought to be rendered with hungry blood. Men filed out to the shade trees. Women clustered in low-voiced knots. Harlan stayed at his table writing something in a careful hand. Mara went behind the church to the well and did not ask whether Eli meant to tell the truth when they reconvened. He found her there with her sleeves rolled and the pump handle under one hand. She had drawn water into a basin and set his bandaged hand beside it without ceremony. "It'll ache worse if you leave the soot in," she said. He sat on the well curb because standing felt foolish with her talking in that tone. She cut away Doc Phelps's wrapping and washed the burn as gently as a woman can do a necessary hurt. The water turned gray. A bee worried clover by the fence. Beyond the cemetery rise, the sky was a hard, clear blue that made grief look smaller than it was and life feel more stubborn for continuing under it. After a while he said, "Why do you really come?" She kept working. "I told you. You told me enough to pass a gate." A corner of her mouth moved without reaching humor. "My husband used to say a clever woman was only useful if she stayed grateful. He liked my sums when they saved him embarrassment. He liked my silence when they didn't. After he died, I found debts, lies, and 3 men's wedding watches in his trunk. Your letters were under the watches." She wrung out the cloth. I opened one for the return address. There wasn't one. Then I read the first line, and it sounded like a man sitting alone trying not to disappear. I knew something about houses like that. Eli looked at the pump spout, at the water dripping from it into dry dirt and darkening the dust in a narrow, honest line. "Were you afraid to bring them?" "Terrified." "Then why do it?" She tied fresh, clean strips around his hand, not meeting his eye until the knot was secure. "Because if all the decent things get left undone by people who are frightened, then frightened is just another word for selfish." He let that sit. A gust moved through the cottonwoods and laid a cool shadow over them for half a breath. When it passed, the sun came back warmer than before. "I was going to deny them," he admitted. "Last night, when the sheriff first looked at you and the letters like they were the same sort of trouble." "I know." "How?" "You keep your chin still when you're about to lie for somebody else's good and your jaw tight when you're about to lie for your own." He almost laughed. Instead, he washed her hands. She had a fine way with bandages. Firm enough to hold, loose enough for blood. "Why didn't you leave this morning?" he asked. She set the basin aside. "Because I was tired of leaving houses to people who made them smaller." That was when he told her about Anna in full. Not as he had told Rose Vale in loops and sideways confessions, but plain. Anna who laughed with her whole face. Anna who hated hens and loved horses. Anna who had asked him, on the morning he rode north for that last profitable drive, whether money always had to arrive before tenderness. He had kissed her forehead and said he would be back before the leaves turned. He had come back to a grave with no grass yet, and a cradle his sister had the good sense to take away before he saw it. Mara listened the way thirsty ground takes rain, quietly, without performance. When he finished, she rested her forearms on her knees and looked out past the cemetery stones to the road. "Most things worth keeping are mended where the strain was worst," she said. He breathed in. The line went through him like a needle pulling something torn toward closure. If that found something true in you, if you know what it is to hear one plain sentence lay a hand on an old wound, then leave a like and stay subscribed for more stories that remember broken people are not finished people. Some comforts are worth coming back to. Footsteps sounded on the other side of the church. Noon was ending. Eli reached into his coat pocket and felt the cold metal there. The railway clerk's badge Mara had handed him that morning when emptying her satchel for the hearing. Owen Quinn's name still scratched faint under the tarnish. Harlan would use it if Eli let him. The easiest way to gut every doubt in the room would be to hold up that badge and say, "Yes, the letters passed through a thief's hands, and here sits the widow of that thief. Look how she has come begging redemption on another man's misery." He took the badge out, looked at it once, and closed his fingers over it. When they went back inside, June Pritchard saw the motion. She saw him slide the badge back into his pocket instead of onto the table. Her eyes lifted to his. She said nothing. She did not need to. A person who had sorted other people's mail for 30 years knew when a man had chosen not to take more than he was owed. The afternoon session began with Sheriff Noland calling Eli forward. He laid his unburned hand on the Bible. The bandaged one rested against his thigh. "Did you write the letters addressed to Rose Vale?" the sheriff asked. "Yes." A murmur moved through the hall. "Is Rose Vale a real person?" "No." "Then why write to her?" "There are rooms where a man hears his own life decide what kind of story it will become." Eli looked past the sheriff to the back windows where light had shifted westward and caught the dust above the pews. He thought of all those Sundays. Coffee cooling, pen scratching, the bay horse in the yard. No witness but a lamp. Because I was alone, he said. And alone has a sound to it after enough years. I wanted somewhere to set that sound down. No one laughed. He gave them the dates. The shipments. The April count. The torn-eared brindle steer. The lame pair held back. The store credit cut from Mrs. Baines after her boy's fever. He did not mention Owen Quinn's trunk. He did not hand over the badge. When Harlan pressed about false signatures on a flower note, Eli turned not to the paper in his pocket that would have publicly shamed the widow, but to Mrs. Baines herself. "Ma'am," he said gently, "were you frightened when you signed what Mr. Voss put before you?" Mrs. Baines, who worried every hem in town as if cloth could save her, stood with both hands clenched in her apron. She looked from Eli to Harlan and then to the floor. "Yes," she whispered. "Did he tell you your boy's medicine would stop if you refused?" This time she lifted her chin. "He did." That broke the room more cleanly than outrage would have. Harlan began to object. June cut across him with her ledger. Ben Morley added his complaint about the quick-settling beam. Then, from the side aisle, came a voice no one expected. The rail clerk from Medicine Bow had arrived late, hat in hand, red-faced from haste. He had ridden after finding an old freight memorandum misfiled in a pigeonhole behind twine spools. 63 had received in April from Rourke stock. 2 held back lame. 1 brindle with torn left ear noted troublesome at shoot. Eli's letters had not solved the case alone. They had done what truth often needed most. They had held long enough for other truthful things to catch up. Harlan did not collapse. Men like him rarely did. He stood very straight while Reverend Pike, Sheriff Noland, the rail memorandum, June's postmarks, Mrs. Baines's testimony, and Eli's shame all accumulated into a weight even polished boots could not step around. In the end, it was not a shout that undid him. It was arithmetic. The note on the spring was suspended pending county review. The scale books were ordered examined. Store claims tied to disputed tallies were frozen. Sheriff Noland, who had polished neutrality like silver all morning, found sudden spine once the room turned. Harlan gathered his papers with precise fingers. For a moment, Eli thought the man might beg or rage or try one last velvet lie. He did none of it. He looked at Mara first, then at Eli, and something dimmed behind the polish. Not remorse. More like the first startled knowledge that a door he had always assumed would open now had a man standing in it. He left to the sound of no one's applause. Practical matters took the next weeks, because victory without chores is just talk in better clothing. County men came. Ledgers were checked. More ranchers found they had been light-counted. Harlan Voss did not go to jail, not then, but he lost the weighing contract, then the confidence of the bank in Laramie, then the habit townspeople had of acting as if his opinion were weather. His store still stood. Men still bought nails there if they had to. But power had begun to leak from him in all the places power hates, slowly, publicly, and through numbers no one could argue with. The spring stayed with Eli. Toby, walking the pasture one evening with a swagger he had not earned but was trying on, said, "Reckon Mr. Voss ain't so tall now." Eli watched the creek take evening light under the cottonwoods. Men shrink quickest when folks stop holding them up. Mara stayed through the audit, then through first frost. Then through the week, June came out with a crate of discarded primers and said the bunkhouse annex had windows enough for lessons if somebody cared to use them. Mara cared. She scraped paint. Toby built shelves crooked and then straightened them under instruction. Mrs. Baines sent apples. Ben Morley donated a cast-off slate big enough for spelling and sums. Children who had once been told not to ask questions in stores began arriving at the Rourke place on weekday mornings with scrubbed faces and cautious eyes. Eli found he liked the sound of recitation drifting out across the yard while he worked tack under the porch eave. Multiplication carried nicely in dry air. So did laughter, once it got used to the place. He did not ask Mara to become Rose Vale. He would rather have cut off his own hand. One evening in late October, after the children had gone and the first hard cold had silvered the pump handle, he came in from the barn to find her standing at the table with the letters spread once more before her. She had sorted them by season, ribboning years together. "I was thinking," she said, not looking up. "These ought to have a proper box before mice discover literature. I can make one." She smiled down at the paper. "I know." He set his gloves on the stove. The kitchen smelled of onion, wool, and the faint, clean bite of snow somewhere far off, still deciding whether to commit. Mara, she lifted her eyes. If you mean to leave come spring, I won't pretend I won't mind it. But I won't ask you to stay out of gratitude either. I had enough of half-true arrangements before I learned better. Her face changed then, not into surprise exactly, but into the sort of softness earned people wear when they hear their own caution treated with respect. What would you ask? She said. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. He knew horses better than women and weather better than either, but there were moments when a man had to throw the rope anyway and trust his hands. I'd ask whether this place feels smaller with you in it, he said, or larger. She considered that. Outside, the bay horse stamped once in the yard. From the annex came Toby's voice, teaching himself to read signboards out loud because he thought no one could hear. Larger, she said. Then stay while it does. No grand embrace followed. No thunder of music. No spectacle fit for people who had never had to keep going after ordinary ruin. She crossed the room and put his mail knife in his hand. Then build the box, she said. He did. Walnut, lined with blue cloth from an old dress of hers too worn at the hem to mend honestly. He sanded it smooth. She tucked the letters inside by lamplight, not as relics of foolishness, but as records of a man who had written himself back toward the world before he knew the road could work both ways. Winter came. The school kept. Harlan's store windows grew dusty. June Pritchard took to bringing gossip and cinnamon biscuits every second Saturday, whether invited or not. Mrs. Baines's boy recovered enough to trap rabbits by the creek. Toby learned to set his figures in straight columns under Mara's eye and his fence staples under Eli's. By February, there were 2 coffee cups warming by the stove each dawn without anyone having to think about it first. In March, the county closed its review. Harlan Voss was fined, his remaining claims cut to bone, and his authority ended not with drama, but with a document filed in Rawlins and a silence in town when he entered a room. By late May, the cottonwoods had leafed out along the creek in a green so new it made old men stand quiet. School let out for planting week. The south pasture held. Calves bawled from the branding pen. Mara rode back from town that afternoon with seed packets in her satchel and a bundle of copybooks under one arm. Eli met her at the gate because he had found, to his surprise and then to his comfort, that waiting for one particular rider had become the finest part of many days. He took the copybooks from her. She slid down from the mare with the same honest stiffness she had brought onto his land the first time. Less fear now. More home. I saved one, she said, drawing a final envelope from her pocket. It was addressed to Rose Vale in his own hand, postmarked 3 months before her arrival, never opened, never read. He turned it over. Didn't know there was one left. I thought perhaps you should decide whether the last word belongs in the box or the stove. He looked at the envelope a long moment, then at her, then past her to the yard where Toby had left a pair of children's slates against the porch rail, and June's old dog slept under the lilac bush as though permanent belonging were the simplest habit in the world. He slipped the envelope into his shirt pocket unopened. Sometimes the life you prayed for comes riding under the wrong name, he said, and when the supper lamp shone across the yard that evening, her hat hung beside his by the door while the bay and the mare stood nose to nose at the rail, waiting for morning like they had always belonged to it. Next time, I'll tell you about the farm widow who hired a drifter to bury her husband before the ground froze, only to learn by midnight that the man digging the grave knew the dead man's real name. Until then, keep the lamp lit and rest easy tonight.